Speaker. So Dr. Matthew Barrett, we're thrilled that you accepted our invitation today. We're thrilled to have you. So we welcome you.
Thanks, Glenn, for all those kind words. So I had completed my PhD at Queen's 2019. I then did a postdoc at the Canadian War Museum, finished that in 2021. And through the postdoc, I was working on this project, a graphic history of 07, which I'm going to speak to you today. So thank you to everyone who attended this morning. And thank you to the Central Ontario branch of the Western Front Association for inviting me. So I'm honored to speak about my book, Through Their Eyes, which is published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2022. I illustrated the book and co-wrote it with fellow historian Robert Engen, who is currently teaching at the War College in Australia. He's a great collaborator, and really without him, the book wouldn't have gotten off the ground. So today I'm going to be speaking about the creation and content of our book. Throughout, I'll be showing you some sample pictures. It's of course our hope that everyone would be interested to pick up a copy for themselves. I think it makes a great gift for the Christmas season coming up, either for you or for someone else. So it's available in hardcover from McGill Queen's. I think it's now also available in softcover from McGill Queen's. For a while, the paperback was exclusive to chapters, so it can be purchased through Amazon, McGill Queen's University's press website. So as I hope you can see, this works.
Okay. Technology.
Always a fail.
So as I hope you can see, it's a different type of history book. With nearly 250 illustrated pages, we combine image and text to explore Canada's Great War from multiple perspectives. It's one of the first graphic histories released by a Canadian university press, and graphic histories resemble comic books or graphic novels. However, the historical study of images, narrative, and arguments are all based on research and documentation to ensure that a factual basis of the work can be achieved. For instance, while it's fully illustrated, we also include detailed references and endnotes. One of our aims with the book was to develop new approaches to Canadian military history. We seek creative ways to connect readers with an understanding of the First World War, which may appear to some quite distant, now more than a century on. There's sometimes a gulf between an academic book designed for an academic audience and more popular histories read by the wider public. We hope that Through Their Eyes appeals to readers of all ages and those curious about new ways to study and teach history. Many educators have discovered the opportunities for graphic narrative, for teaching and engaging students. Graphic novels in classrooms today is notable due to some of the old stigmas against comics, which were once dismissed as simply entertainment for children. Despite the growing acceptance of graphic narrative in education, it's still rare to see an original work like ours of graphic scholarship appear as a peer-reviewed book. Now, so why did we take this graphic history approach? I see three contributions that it can make to our understanding of history. The first is to create accessible but critical sources that can reach audiences beyond the specialist academic audience. The second is to produce a rich learning resource suitable for classrooms and education. And third, I think it encourages historians and readers to think more deeply about the interpretation and representation of the past. We hope that this is innovative graphic history that invites readers to reimagine the First World War through the eyes of those who lived it, and to think more deeply about how we visualize, remember, and commemorate the past. Let's see if it works this time.
Too fast. Making up for the first not behaving.
There we go. So given the vast scope of the war, in our book we focus on the context surrounding the specific battle in August 1917, known as Hill 70. As this is the main focus of the book, I think it's useful for some background on the battle's place in the wider war effort. So as all of you would know, in April 1917, Canadian troops had captured Vimy Ridge, but Allied defenses soon stalled across many fronts. To help break the stalemate of trench warfare, the new Canadian Corps commander, Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, was tasked with capturing Hill 70, a German stronghold near the French industrial town of Lens. Hill 70 is simply a trench map designation. It is used to calculate the number of meters it is above sea level. So ultimately it's a relatively gentle slope, not much of a hill, but that's nevertheless the name that history has given to this battle. The nearby town of Lens had been captured by the Germans in October 1914 during the invasion of France, and almost a year later, in September 1915, during the Battle of Loos, the British army had fought to capture Hill 70 and did briefly before the Germans pushed them back. So the attack failed ultimately with tens of thousands of British casualties. One notable casualty was the son of Rudyard Kipling. After 2 years of vicious fighting on the Western Front, it passed before the ground would be contested again. So in June 1917, Currie was appointed the first Canadian-born commander of the Canadian Corps. His first assignment was planning the assaults on Hill 70 and Lens. The objective was to capture the hill and then divert German reinforcements from the big push that the British were making to the north in Passchendaele. After securing the hill on August 15th, Canadian troops endured days of relentless German counterattacks with shelling, machine gun fire, and poison gas. Between August 21st and August 25th, 2 Canadian divisions attempted to take the town of Lens itself at great cost, but were eventually pushed back. Nevertheless, Canadian troops had captured Hill 70 and secured the high ground, which the Germans never really contested again for the rest of the war. The battle cost about 9,000 Canadian casualties, including 2,000 killed in action. The Germans, meanwhile, suffered perhaps 25,000 casualties. Hill 70 has more an elusive character than most better-known Canadian battles. It's named for an otherwise nondescript geographic location. The legacy of Hill 70 is also somewhat complicated in that it was a great victory in securing the hill, but also a setback in not actually capturing the town of Lens itself. It showed that such achievements also came at profound human price and lives. The attempt to take Lens had failed, and ultimately the overall strategic aim to divert German reinforcements from Passchendaele didn't necessarily pan out exactly as the British had in mind. By October 1917, the Canadians themselves were then sent to the killing fields of Passchendaele, during which time thousands more would be killed and wounded. In the decade after the war, the Battle of Hill 70 partly faded from Canadian memory, as it was caught between the more famous Battle of Vimy Ridge and the more infamous Battle of Passchendaele. Hill 70, as Canada's forgotten victory, has since been in part corrected by the Hill 70 Memorial Project. It's in fact, this book wouldn't come to an existence without their efforts and the wider commemorative work of the project. So in addition to fundraising for the creation of this impressive monument in France, the Hill 70 Project also distributed education kits to thousands of schools across Canada. As part of these packages, some years ago, Rob and I collaborated and created 2 shorter, more graphic novel style booklets. And there was a great deal of interest from students and teachers. So in 2019, the Hill 70 project was generous enough to fund the creation of this much more substantive volume. Hardcover is on my right, and the softcover is on the far left. So the book itself is divided into 6 chapters. The first explains my illustrated approach to history and uses examples of wartime photography and painting to consider what constitutes accurate representations of the war. The second chapter details Curry's appointment as Corps Commander and his challenging role planning the Hill 70 attack. Then in chapters 3 and 4, we tell the stories of a lieutenant who led a platoon at Hill 70 and a private who was killed during the fighting in Lens. Lieutenant Brock Chisholm earned the Military Cross at Hill 70, and his name may be familiar because in later life he was head of the World Health Organization. The private, Private Frederick Lee, was one of the very few Canadians of Chinese ancestry to serve in the infantry. His chapter explores how we as historians piece together a narrative of his life based on the fragmentary record that we have. We have his service file, which indicates that he went to France in February 1917 and then died in August 1917. So that's really all that we had to go with. Some few other references to him in the historical record. So we had to sort of draw on the unit war diary. He served with the 47th Battalion and some other sources. And so that chapter is sort of how we as historians are piecing together a narrative of his life based on these limited records that we have. Chapters 5 and 6 then use different artistic styles to feature vignettes of several different participants who served in the battle, including the 6 Canadians who received Victoria Cross at Hill 70. So as the illustrated volume, I'll now speak about some of the artistic choices and challenges I had in attempting to illustrate the past. That's the ad itself from the Go Queens. So when reporting on the Battlefield 70, one Toronto Globe correspondent noted no artist can paint the horrors of the battlefield or convey in adequate terms what the fighting in the Lens region has meant for the Canadian lads who have gone through it. So this reporter correctly noted that no painter could truly represent the experiences of being in battle under fire and gas, while surrounded by scenes of carnage and death. At Hill 70, just as in any battle, neither visual art nor the written word could capture the destructive scale of the operations, the deep emotions of the thousands of soldiers involved, or the personal meaning of their struggles. Yet, in Through Their Eyes, we have attempted to visualize the horrors and heroism of the battle and convey what the fighting meant for a number of different participants. In doing so, we have used this graphic history approach to explore how to imagine and interpret the First World War in different art forms from different perspectives. In the book, we argue that representations of the past are not meant to be precise reconstructions. Truth and authenticity are not simply found in realistic depictions that claim accuracy in every tiny detail. The seeming objectivity of photographs or lifelike quality of highly realistic paintings can in fact obscure the uncertainties and unknowns that historians grapple with when trying to convey the complexity of the past. Historians do not simply reconstruct an event only based on available archival traces, such as letters and diaries. They also engage in a creative process of connection, construction, and imagination based on historical research to assemble a coherent and meaningful narrative. The subjectivity of drawings and the limitation of sequential art to depict individual snapshots visualizes this interpretive research process. The pictures assume greater meaning and context once readers mentally link one image to the next in the series. The book's introduction opens with one of the most famous photographs of the war, which I just showed. Canadian troops going over the top. You've likely seen this image in all sorts of contexts in media. It's especially used around Remembrance Day as an iconic representation of the Western Front. In attempting to capture a truthful image of the war, photographers and artists worked to achieve authenticity in different ways. Canada's official war photographer at that time, Ivor Castle, did so by claiming first-hand experiences documenting scenes alongside Canadian troops at or near the front lines. He described his work implying that it took place under fire. He produced this iconic over-the-top image, which appeared to show a genuine action shot. In fact, it was pieced together from different photos taken in training exercises. The explosion clouds in the background were imposed later on. In cutting and combining a real set of photographs to produce this scene, an artist engages in a similar process of imaginative creation. But the final image, in this case a manufactured photograph, could appear realistic enough to leave viewers with the impression that had been taken at the time of the actual event. So this example made me think about why we might call this stitched together photo a fake, while accepting an artistic interpretation of the battle as simply an impression. During the war, many soldier artists who experienced the fighting and witnessed the shattered landscape moved away from the realism favored in 19th century military paintings. A good example of this older style is Richard Jack's Second Ypres. For a new generation of soldier artists, truth and authenticity could be revealed by modernist abstract designs for emotional expression rather than technical accuracy or lifelike realism. Some art critics at the time expressed a clear preference for realistic and representational art. Arthur Curry himself favored traditionally realistic paintings and regarded these more abstract methods as what he called freak pictures. So how might my art and Through Their Eyes be evaluated by critics such as these? It could be judged by how closely the image resembles reality, the past as it was, or at least as we think it was. So to give an example of this process, we could begin with a simple black and white sketch. Then we would fill in color, line, shadow, shape, to give it some depth and meaning. But maybe some of the details are off. With enough time and effort, a more realistic depiction could be achieved, but any drawing would fall short of photorealism. So why not replace these various details with extracts of actual photos? And then why stop at the guns and the helmets? Why not replace the entire scene with bits of contemporary photos to achieve a sort of realism? That. We end up with a faked photo, which may be accurate in every small detail, but overall the scene is as imagined as that original sketch. I argue that in attempting to get all the details precisely accurate, reaches a point where a drawing must either pass into meticulous photographic realism or retreat into a simpler, more expressive, or even more cartoon style. A comic panel in a style of fabricated photos may achieve a type of photorealism, but I think the sequence of images would be jarring to the viewer, as it confuses the distinction between real and faked. Graphic history emphasizes what readers are viewing is construction that is informed by historical research and interpretation, and assembled to produce a truthful, if not necessarily completely realistic scene. In this graphic history, we have attempted to show how we can visualize the war in these different artistic styles from different perspectives. Curry's strategic view from high command, a junior officer's perspective like Brock Chisholm, the 6 Victoria Cross recipients, and an ordinary Canadian like Frederick Lee, and many other lesser-known individuals who did not survive. By provoking questions about historical accuracy, truth, and meaning, this work is both focused on a specific battle of the First World War, as well as interested in expanding the ways that history can be researched, shared, and represented. Combining image and text not only invite readers to consider different ways to interpret history, it also importantly helps us to appreciate our own role in connecting, constructing, and imagining the stories of the past that we tell. I hope that I've shared today prompts everyone to consider picking up a copy of the book themselves, or at least maybe advise others to do likewise. I have to say how pleased I am with the overall design work that McGill-Queens went into producing such a fine volume. It's a fairly thick, good coffee table sized book. But I'd also like to mention that I do have another book, Scandalous Conduct. So maybe it's fitting that we're doing this talk today in the officer's mess, because what my PhD was on was officer dismissal, and what my thesis was about the history of courts martial and officer dismissal and cashiering, which has become this book published by UBC Press. So it examines how changing definitions of scandalous conduct in military culture shape the quintessential honor crime known as conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. It details the circumstances under which hundreds of Canadian officers lost their commissions with all sorts of offenses, ranging from cowardice and indecency to drunkenness and fraud. So there are lots of fascinating stories of crime, scandal, and occasional redemption for Canadian ex-officers during both World Wars. I should mention that I know of at least 3, perhaps 4 Canadian officers who were dismissed at Hill 70. In the question period, you can ask for further details. In one instance, it was someone who was told to prepare his company, a lieutenant, to prepare his company for an action, and he fell to pieces and panicked. Another officer had to come in and take his place, and this guy was eventually court-martialed and dismissed for, to use the terminology at the time, unsoldierly-like language, in which he said that he was afraid and didn't think that his men would follow his direction. This individual, his name was Lieutenant Lean. He was dismissed in 1917, sent back to Canada, and by the 1930s, he was president of the local Vancouver Canadian Legion. So that's just sort of an indication that a bad war record doesn't necessarily preclude you from still participating in veteran activities, and in this case, somehow being head of the Canadian Legion in Vancouver. And before I even continue on with scandalous conduct, I should also mention I do have a website which I've been running for about 9 years now, and I profile every Canadian battalion commander of the First World War, and I've recently started in the Second World War. So every single Canadian led a battalion in action, and in the First World War there were quite a few numbered battalions that were raised that never actually went into action. So the colonel was more or less a prominent individual in the community, tasked with raising the units, recruiting the battalion, and then once it got overseas, it was very typical for those battalions to be broken up, and then the colonel was sort of left without anything to do. So I profile all of those who served in the First World War. I've just started on to those who were Canadian battalion commanders in the Second World War. I sort of resisted going into the Second World War for a while. I thought that it'd be much more difficult to find information about some of these colonels, because I don't know if you have looked into the sort of hierarchy, the listings of all the criminals, but in 1919, 1920, there was a book of the Canadians in the First World War, and it has a listing of every single battalion commander. So identifying them was pretty easy. To my knowledge, there doesn't exist the same kind of detail for the Second World War, so that's one of my projects. I'm bringing, on my site, there'll be a listing of every single unit in the Second World War, every single battalion commander. And since I'm an artist, I like to do caricatures of them all, where I can find a photo of one of them. And in fact, I was just looking at the back wall there, and Lieutenant Colonel Shell, who served in Italy with the Ontario Regiment in 1943 and 1944. I couldn't find a picture of him, but there he is. And I can now do a caricature of him as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions about officership, battalion commanders, if you have any. Too far. To return to Through the Rise, I'd like to conclude with a thought about those who fell at Hill 70 in August 1917. About 2,000 Canadians were killed or died of wounds. Bodies of half of this number were lost to the battlefield and never recovered for proper burial. One of the... I'll just put it up. So this image from the book on the left is a listing of all those whose bodies were not recovered and therefore memorialized on the Vimy regiment, on the Vimy Memorial. The size of the name reflects the number of individuals with that name. So Smith is the largest, that represents about 20 Canadians who had the name Smith, whose bodies were not recovered. And in total, the page represents about 1,000. So about half of those who fell at Hill 70, their bodies were never recovered. I find this image particularly poignant to close on because in recent years, the remains of, I believe, 8, possibly 9 at this point, Canadians at Hill 70 have been found, identified, and reburied in an official war cemetery. Some of you may have heard of the recent news with DND's Casualty Identification Program, which was able to put the name to the remains of 8 or 9 Canadians who died at Hill 70. Sometimes lost in the carnage of the war and the movements of mass armies was that each of these scenes that we depict represented a unique person and story. Throughout this book, we have attempted to combine art, narrative, and historical research to visualize and personalize experiences from the Battle of Hill 70, and to place the individuals within the wider context of the war effort. What I hope Through Their Eyes shows is that reimagining and narrating these experiences can give voice to ordinary Canadians who endured a battle now over 105 years ago. Thank you. So we just, glad we just take questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to say that I think it's brilliant that you're using the graphic novel type approach to this, because you're reaching a whole new generation. And I have a kid who's one of the designers who I work with, and I told him I'm reading a book about the war starting in Africa. I had no idea about all this. Well, this kid, he told me the generals, he told me the units, he told me like where they were, what they were doing, who fought who. I said, how do you know all this? And he said, well, video games.
Yeah.
So that's his in. And this is a new way for young people to get in. Like I started with watching the Blue Max, and sorry, I admit it, my first one endless, a lot, to inspire my interest. But that was my in, and that was like 150 years ago that I got into all this. So there you go. So I think you're doing a brilliant job of reaching out to the new generation. So congratulations.
Yeah, that was a priority for us. That was a priority for us to reach different audiences.
Yeah.
There is sometimes an idea in academic circles that it's all about the text, it's all about sort of a dense work, and ultimately some academics don't really care how widely read their work is. They're very much insular and kind of focused on their own community. And I think it's important that we can develop different books or resources that can reach different audiences. And so, I mean, our work is one example with using graphics and illustrations, but I think you bring up a great point about video games or movies. It's about what is it that people get kind of excited about and interested in, and then maybe they'll return to a more academic book about the subject, or they'll continue to research on their own. So I think that that's it's a priority I'm trying to bring also in my job as a managing editor to CMH too. Yeah.
So along that line, the precursor to this that you just did on Hill 70, back for the centenary and when they put up the monument, do you know how many volumes of that they distributed across Canada?
I'm told that they had thousands of packages that they sent out. Hill 70 put together these fairly in-depth curriculum packages, so with all sorts of lesson plans and resources for the teachers. And within those packages, they included a English and French translation of the graphic novels. Now, because of sort of limitations on printing and distribution, they can only include one copy of the graphic novel in each package, so it's sort of going to a whole classroom, and ultimately you have one book. So I think in a few cases they were able to get a classroom set to people, but teachers found it quite useful, and that's one of the arguments we could bring to the Hill 70 group, to say, people are interested in this sort of thing, teachers are finding it useful, we should develop a more robust book, a more scholarly book, a more complete book, and they were able to agree. So I'm not sure exactly how many copies, it's in the thousands, but from what I understand, it's still used in some cases. So I think teachers have found it useful.
With the scandalous conduct, I don't want to sort of walk into a minefield of my own here, but was there different levels of being held responsible for your conduct, like the common man accused of cowardice could be shot and some were? What happened to the officers? I'm just sort of wondering, if you get cashiered, I don't know, I just sort of wondering.
Yeah. Well, in the history of kind of military culture and martial justice, there was a long-standing argument for the officer class, kind of the officer and gentleman mentality, that cashiering was supposed to be symbolically as bad as a death sentence. Obviously, that's not the case. You get cashiered, you're not actually being killed, but it's supposed to represent this is the social death. You're being removed from an institution like this. You can no longer go to the office mess. You're now going to be shunned by your fellow officers. So it's supposed to represent the kind of that social death penalty. And so just before the First World War in Britain, there was a debate among kind of the developing Labour Party, sort of the working class mentality that, wait a second here, you have a punishment for other ranks of being, either physically disciplined or possibly executed, and then you have this social penalty that's supposed to be against officers. And they were sort of pointing out this double standard that the Army was sort of uncomfortable with, because they were still invested in this idea of the officer and gentleman, separate classes. The First World War sort of exposed that to some degree, and one of the arguments that the Labour Party used against the death penalty was the fact that 300 plus Canadian and Commonwealth soldiers were executed for desertion or cowardice, and something like 3 officers were executed, one of who was executed for murder. So it doesn't necessarily count in a military crime context. So by 1930s, they had removed the penalty of execution for a desertion or military crimes like that. And the social class structure, however, it still continued. Cashiering and dismissal was still seen as separate from punishments to soldiers. I mean, just think of the punishments. So for a soldier, if you're convicted of something, maybe you get field punishment number 1, in which case you're being tied to a stake, or you might be held in detention, or even imprisoned. For an officer, it was to be dismissed. So it was to end your war. So it was to send you home, potentially out of danger. And we can still see sort of the legacy of that today a bit in sort of the martial justice system. By 1950, they sort of overhauled, the Canadian government had overhauled the Canadian sort of discipline process, and now dismissal as punishment applies equally to non-commissioned members and commissioned members. So it's the idea of dismissal, like, is it punishment, is it not a punishment? It really depends on the person. If the person feels that it's a punishment, then perhaps, as many did, they would re-enlist and then, in some cases, be wounded or die in fighting for their redemption. But for those who honor didn't really factor into their decision-making, to be dismissed was to be removed from danger. And as the one I mentioned, Lieutenant Gleam, he was dismissed at Hill 70. He then got in trouble for sort of these bad checks that he was doing, and so still trying to use his officer status. And then somehow, 2 decades later, he's the head of the Canadian Legion in Vancouver. So it's an interesting punishment. And Rick raised a good point about the discrepancy between the different classes of discipline. Yeah.
I remember reading at least one story where an officer was dismissed for drunkenness, continuing drunkenness in AWOL, and he was pressured into becoming a private. How often did that happen?
Pretty frequently.
Okay.
So in the First World War, about 40% of those who were dismissed ultimately re-enlisted, and of the 40%, I think a fifth were killed in action. So I mean, these aren't huge numbers, but I mean, still, that's fairly significant. There was some social pressure once you were dismissed to re-enlist and to redeem yourself. Drunkenness was a very common cause of dismissal in the First World War. Officers had sort of a greater access to the rum ration in the trenches that they were supposed to distribute to other soldiers. And then there's also the issue of sometimes mental breakdown can be confused or deliberately mistaken for intoxication, in which case they're being dismissed. But yeah, but re-enlistment happened fairly frequently, which I think indicates that honor was important to them, even if they were in some cases being pressured into rejoining. I think it indicates that they cared about the disgrace that they would face when they were being sent home, and so they wanted to sort of stay overseas and be re-enlisted. There's actually a relatively famous story of a Canadian lieutenant named Owen Jones, who was the son or nephew of the former lieutenant governor of Nova Scotia. He was also nephew of the head of the Canadian Medical Services in the First World War. He was allegedly drunk on his first trench raid in 1916. Not really sure if it was drunkenness or if it was sort of the nervousness of being in action for the first time. But in any case, he was dismissed immediately almost. But when he got back to England, he re-enlisted. He went to serve with, I believe it was the 42nd Battalion, and then he became a proficient trench raider, and he was honored and decorated for the fact that he was out, as one general said, redeeming himself by killing Germans. And he was recommissioned, but then very badly wounded. And there were all kinds of newspaper stories that happened in 1918 about his redemption. So that's another theme that was useful for recruiting, to show that you can be dismissed and disgraced, but you can still redeem yourself in battle.
This guy that I read about, within 6 months he was back to being a company sergeant major.
Yeah, there was sometimes a relatively quick promotion. Because if you can prove yourself that you've redeemed your mistake, you were an officer, so you have some leadership qualities. So, you know, sometimes it was a reward of showing that you kind of took your medicine, to use some of the terminology at the time, and re-enlisted, and then get your promotions. Yeah.
I think you said that there were 2 Canadian divisions at Hill 70. Which 2, and do you know how Curry went about selecting those 2?
I believe it was I think it was the 1st Division was part of the main thrust, I think, was it the 1st? And then it was the 4th Division.
1st and 4th?
Yeah, who attempted to take Lawrence.
Okay.
I'm not really sure about the exact sort of decision making on why those particular ones. It tended to be that, you know, whoever was sort of in the rotation,
Okay.
that was sort of one of the factors that went into it.
From the replacements, like, because the battle went on for, what was it, like 3 weeks or so. Right?
Yeah.
So, but after the initial assault, then they rotated, like I know the 116th rotated in at the later 5 or 6
Yeah,
days of it. So I'd assume that there's quite a few different brigades that were rotated in just because of the casualty. So.
Yeah, yeah. Like, and the initial assault, I think it was the 15th Battalion, the 7th Battalion, I want to say 13th. So those were the battalions that sort of made the initial push to capture the hill, and then they passed the next sort of stage off to another set of battalions, and then they would have to hold the position, and then by the end of the battle, so they rotated, so new battalions kind of came in, fresh people came in.
But perhaps some consideration is that Curry was, the 1st Division, of course, had been over there longest, and he was that division commander, so he probably knew a lot of people in that division, had
Yeah.
confidence in them.
Yeah, exactly.
That may be one of the reasons why he started with them. And as you say, they rotate out to others.
Yeah, so when Curry was initially tasked with this objective, initially the idea from the British was capture the town of Lawrence. And then Curry thought that that would be a mistake, and so he thought it'd be better to capture the high ground of Hill 70. So that became the main priority. But then when the Canadians had the success of capturing Hill 70, then they thought, oh, we can follow this up with taking the town itself. And then that's where it became bogged down into urban warfare, and then they were eventually pushed back.
Yeah, I know units, it still goes on today. I know units oftentimes like to invent their own mythology of why they were in a particular place as opposed to somebody else. But, and I know in the case of the 15th Battalion, which is what our project focuses on, they like to think that they were handpicked by General Curry to be on that exposed left flank, what they call the hinge of the whole corps' assault. Maybe, maybe not, but certainly the 1st Division, as most people know, was kind of regarded as the veteran division. Certainly no coincidence that Curry came from that division. And the 3rd Brigade within the division was, again, mythology or not, kind of regarded as the veteran brigade of that division. And they were right up to the north, and the other brigades, they were actually on Hill 70 and Hugo. How much truth there is in all of that as opposed to the simple, divisional and brigade rotation of units, so many days in, so many days out, why a particular unit was here as opposed to back there was probably more due to simple rotation.
Yeah.
The one thing I found fascinating, my kids bought the book for my Christmas last year. The one thing I found fascinating was not just the story, because I'm familiar with the story, but really the different types of art styles that you use to portray each of these. Like, that's the individual soldier stories or parts of the battle. So can you talk about that? Just for anyone who has a look at the book, it applies it. the visuals that you create are just phenomenal. I'm really impressed with the varied styles of art that you use to portray these guys.
No, thank you. Thanks so much. So I sort of have my standard style that's sort of this kind of a rough illustrative quality, realistic but also a little cartoony. As I talked about, I really believe that if you make something super realistic, there's the risk of falling into the uncanny valley. And I think that there's also an uncanny valley from a historical perspective, that if you try to push something into being super realistic, then you're exposing where details are going to be wrong. So it's simplifying it a bit so you can kind of get away with maybe everything isn't precisely accurate, but it's sort of the design is to give an impression of what these guys would have experienced. So I was very, very much influenced by a lot of the abstract modernist designs that came out of the First World War. So as I talk about, there's this
Olive Dix type of thing.
Exactly, yeah. So I have a picture that depicts sort of in that Olive Dix style. He was a German artist soldier that had a very sort of visceral black and white sketch approach. And there's all kinds of different other more modernist and abstract designs that came out of the First World War that's in reaction to that older sort of 19th century realistic approach that if you see it, you may mistake it for this is how it actually was because the humans are depicted as humans because all the details are very finely depicted. But I think there's a lot of value in the simpler and abstract methods too. I probably wish I'd been able to sort of have more of that in the book, to have more sort of interpretive and expressive and sort of abstract designs, but I always sort of fall back to what my preferred style is, which is sort of the main illustrative approach that I have throughout the book. But thank you so much, though, for your kind words.
Just go back to this scandalous conduct book. How did we, like the British, stack up against, compare with the French and the Germans with regards to this whole thing? I always get the impression the French were really nasty about it, just because of the movies that came out. And where did so how do you compare the tolerance?
Like Paths of Glory.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's something I've been really interested in. I'd like to learn more about what other countries were doing in terms of discipline, and especially with officers. So just to speak about sort of officer discipline, the British and Canadians followed this sort of traditional model of dismissal cashiering. In the First World War, there's maybe 10% of those who were dismissed or cashiered, also imprisoned, usually for a relatively short time. I mentioned that 3 were executed. I think 5 were sentenced to death, but the other 5 were eventually commuted to something less. So the British and us really followed this idea of disgracing the officer's honor as a form of kind of deterrence. That if you cared about your honor, you're not going to misconduct yourself, and you're going to try to avoid that shame. From what I understand, the Germans had sort of a similar obsession or fascination with officer honor. They had sort of a separate court system for officers, the honor courts that would sort of do the same thing, but from maybe more of a professional capacity to disgrace someone's honor. The honor was a big part of sort of that 19th century or 20th century German justice system. The French, I'm not really sure about the French. I know that they did execute many more other ranks than we did. I know of at least one example early in the war. Maybe it's 2 officers who were executed by the French fairly early on. I don't think it was as unknown in the French army for officers to be punished in that way. I know a little bit more from the Second World War, where the Germans had more of a process of demotion, of reducing an officer to be forced to be a private. So a bit to return to your question about them being compelled once they were dismissed in the Canadian context to re-enlist, there actually was no legal function in the British Army system to demote someone from commission rank to private rank. You could dismiss them and then possibly conscript them, but you couldn't forcibly remove someone's commission and then force them to fight as a form of punishment. So we didn't really have that, but the Germans did in the Second World War. They may have had it in the First World War as well. But that's a topic I'd really like to learn more about, to see how we compare, how we punish officers and how other countries have punished officers. But from my knowledge, there doesn't seem to be, there's not much on military justice itself, and there's even less specifically on officer discipline. Yeah.
I don't know if this goes beyond the scope of your book there, but I was wondering, after the war ended, like both wars ended, were there guys still doing time, hard labor or whatever it was, like years after the cessation of hostilities, or do you figure they would be granted clemency or something after a period of...
That's a really good question. So for the First World War, there was one officer, his name was Francis Mission Leader, and he was cashiered and sentenced to, he wasn't cashiered, he was sentenced to death. He was sentenced to death in 1916 for basically refusing in order to go forward. That death sentence was then commuted to cashiering plus 10 years penal servitude. So he's probably the longest, the officer who got the harshest penalty. And it wasn't all that uncommon for other ranks to sometimes get 5 years, 10 years penal servitude. So this guy is convicted in late 1916. He's released in December of 1918. So the war ends, and thinking is sort of, we're just going to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. They were imprisoned generally in British prisons. So the British didn't want to deal with them. So they would just send them back to Canada, and in that process, they were basically released. So in the First World War, the longest serving person that I can think of is an officer who was eventually released in the maybe even 1930. But this was a civil case of murder. He had murdered someone in England. He was convicted civilly in the British criminal justice system. So he was serving until 1930. So that's different than the military justice context, of which very few would have served longer than 1918. In the Second World War, there were about a handful who were still serving their sentences as of sort of 1948 and 1949. Two of them were those who were captured at Dieppe that collaborated with the Germans. There was a few other cases of murder, but the longest serving after the Second World War, a guy sentenced to life in prison for rape and murder in Germany, and he was released in 1950. So here's the harshest penalty, short of death, being life imprisonment, and ultimately it amounted to 5 years imprisonment. So it was very common for them to be released not long after the war.
Do you have any, potential future books under using the same graphic novel? Like this would be really cool for like an air war, or obviously you could probably sell a boatload of Biddy Ridge books. There seems to be a market out there, especially for the next generation. What's your thoughts on kind of what's around the corner?
Yeah, it's something I'm really interested in. I'd like to continue this, to depict history in this sort of graphic way. So I've just started another postdoc that's hosted by the University of Saskatchewan. And so this postdoc is about the history of medicine. And so what I'm looking at is visualizing the invisible wound. So I'm doing a graphic history of shell shock, battle exhaustion, PTSD, combat stress. So that's sort of my short-term project. But there's lots of other ideas that I have, both in a military history context, as you mentioned, kind of air war would be, I think, quite visually interesting. But I'm also thinking about branching a little bit away from military history as well to do sort of how else can Canadian history be depicted in this way too. I don't want to necessarily. I've done the First World War. I don't know if I want to sort of continue to return to that. Yeah, and then.
Hey, I guess you don't want to go the route of the Sergeant Rock comics that I used to read back in the 60s.
Well, I am interested though in sort of that history of how war has been visualized through comic form. Like a big influence for me for this book was Charlie's War from the 1980s, illustrated by a guy named Joe Calhoun. And that was really influential in sort of how I thought about it and tried to depict the First World War. And I think it's useful when we think about our collective imagining of past war, think about the different influences that we have had. So it's movies, it's comics, it's all these things that sort of, in some cases, distort, but also shape how we kind of visualize and what we expect when you think about the history of warfare.
Two things, Matthew. To what Garfield was saying, I traced my interest in this hobby we all have to the Arrow Book Club in grade 5 when I bought the Flying Aces of World War I. A book that was kind of geared towards a young adolescent, a young child, whatever. And here I am today. I mean, it's quite an amazing tool, and I'm continually frustrated about how our cause of remembrance, it's difficult to keep it going with the younger generation. So I salute you for this. It's a great avenue. My question is, battalion commanders from the First World War, what was the highest ranking individual? Like, were there any battalion commanders that were subjected to discipline?
It's a good question. It tended to be the higher you went in rank, the less likely it was you were going to be court-martialed. So it was junior officers, lieutenants, were the vast majority of those who were court-martialed, and especially sentenced to dismissal. Of course, as many of you would know, Arthur Curry himself committed an offense that if he had been of the lower rank, he likely would have been court-martialed and cashiered to pay off his debts. He essentially embezzled money just before the First World War from his militia units, money that was designated for the militia unit. He took to pay off his debts and then forgot or just neglected to pay it back until 1917 when he was promoted to Corps Commander, and then this scandal threatened to become public, and two of his subordinate generals sort of loaned him the money to pay it off. So here he is, highest ranking Canadian, is too important and it would be too scandalous to go through a court-martial for him. Meanwhile, it was not uncommon for officers to be charged and convicted of borrowing money from their subordinates. So a lieutenant might take $1, a pound, as a sort of a loan from a sergeant, and that would be an offense. But Curry took hundreds or thousands of dollars from subordinate generals, and he was not. The highest ranking was a lieutenant colonel. I think there were 2 or 3. The first one that comes to mind was a guy named Wade Jolly, who was a commanding officer of the 97th Battalion. 97th was the American Legion. It was made up of a lot of Americans who came across the border, wanted to fight for Canada, and then joined this unit in Toronto. Wade Jolly had served in the Boxer Rebellion as part of the Marines. He was dismissed from the American Army for financial misconduct in 1913, and then by 1914, 1915, he comes north, joins the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and by the time he gets to England, he is court-martialed and cashiered for, again, financial misconduct. I'm trying to think, there's at least one or two others, lieutenant colonels who were dismissed. I can't think of the details at the moment, but one of the famous cases of colonel misconduct, possibly, would be the 15th Battalion of John Curry, no relation I know of to Arthur Curry, who was at 2nd Yeats with the 15th Battalion. The story was he disappeared behind the lines, allegedly drunk, possibly a mental breakdown from being in action for the first time, and he was, as wasn't uncommon, essentially promoted to get rid of him. He was promoted to colonel, sent guys to Canada, where he sort of had to deal for years with the allegations that he had misbehaved, misconducted himself in action. But at that time, the idea of court-martialing a lieutenant colonel, it just it didn't really factor into a useful decision for the Canadians. It would just be too scandalous, too much administrative work. Plus, you need to fill a court with people of the same rank to convict someone of a lieutenant colonel. So it just logistically, it wasn't easy to convict high ranks.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Curry, because the two Currys
Yeah.
in the same battle both left their positions during the battle.
Yeah.
Of course, Curry went on to be the corps commander. The other Curry, as you said, sent back home. I think he commandant of the infantry school in Borden during the war. But then, of course, after the war, the two there's bad feeling between the two of them.
Yeah.
One sent home, one not.
And it comes out in the very famous Coburg trial in 1928, I think, where Curry brings a libel suit against the Port Hope Evening Times, the newspaper there, that published this story that says that in 1918, as the war was coming to an end, Curry essentially, for his own glorious purposes, did a futile attack that cost Canadian lives. And Curry naturally would be quite offended by this and brought a libel suit against the newspaper. And then everything sort of came out in the trial. The controversies he would have had with the defense minister, Sam Hughes, who by this point was dead, but he and Curry had this big rivalry because Hughes felt like Curry had sort of betrayed him. And then the story of the two Currys sort of comes out in the trial, where the newspaper's lawyers tried to imply that it was, General Curry who was the one that actually was misbehaving in battle, and Colonel Curry was the one that was kind of scapegoated. And then Colonel Curry was put on the witness stand and seemed to just humiliate himself and embarrass himself. And in the end, Curry was exonerated partially in that he was awarded minimal damages, but he still had to deal with a lot of these allegations that were against him, both for his private conduct and his military conduct as well.
And I think the fact that John Curry was a serving member of Parliament when he commanded at 2nd Yeat, that probably saved his rear end too.
Yeah,
and good friends with Hughes.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting to thank you for bringing up that John Curry was also a member of Parliament. I got into this study of lieutenant colonels and arguably my entire interest in the First World War from the research I did for Lieutenant Sam Sharp, who was also a member of Parliament, who served with distinction, and there's sort of this interesting parallel between John Curry, member of Parliament, is serving at the beginning of the war, fails in battle and is sent home in disgrace. And then Sharp, who is serving near the end of the war, in 1917, he goes into action. After a year, he sort of has had enough that he has seen all the suffering and the death, and he has a mental breakdown, and then ultimately, tragically, dies by suicide when he gets back to Canada in 1918. And John Curry was one of the very few to speak out in behalf of Sharp, to say that he should be honored as a battle casualty. So I mean, just a great example of the complexity of history that John Curry, arguably the villainous character, at second heaps of being behind the lines, possibly a coward, but in 1918 he's also advocating on behalf of Sam Sharp. So, I don't really know what to make of John Curry. He's an interesting maverick of a character.
Any more questions?
Can I ask a dumb question?
Go ahead.
Did you do the actual illustrations?
Oh yeah, in case that wasn't clear from the outset, yes, I'm an artist. I did all the illustrations. The book itself is a collaboration between me and Rob. We're both historians, so it was co-written, but I did all the illustrations. Sometimes in these works, a historian will collaborate with an artist, and sometimes the historian, as the writer, gets all the credits. And I just think it's important just to remember that if you ever see a book where it is a writer is collaborating with an artist, that the artist, in high likelihood, had a significant involvement in the creative process, and I think that they should be credited as much with the historical interpretations as the writer.
Just one last question, sorry. Do you think this approach, this kind of graphic novel, which is illustrating, obviously, events quite some time ago, we've already talked about, photograph, probably no more real in some senses than this. Do you think this approach would work in more modern conflicts where there's just an overwhelming abundance of actual footage of combat?
I think it can, because I think that the interpretive nature of illustrations can sort of depict events and people in ways that are specifically not photorealistic. I mean, you could have the war in Ukraine a set of photographs, and I think that can be impactful, but it may not express the emotions of the people who are living through it. And so, through collaboration with an artist, or possibly the people who witness themselves, to depict in a more subjective and creative way that may incorporate photographs as well, but I think there's definitely a place still for the sort of subjective nature and interpretive nature of drawing and art.
Matthew, on behalf of the Central Ontario branch of the Western Front Association, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to visit with us today. And again, I salute you for this remarkable avenue you've taken to reach a new audience. So
Thank you.